native sovereignty, and the doctrine of discovery. Self-determination is the deciding by a people of a nation what form of government they shall have without reference to the wishes of any other nation. The people have a range of choices from total assimilation within another nation, territory status, autonomy, statehood, free association, commonwealth to total independence and sovereignty. This is where the Christian and indigenous theologies are perpetually in conflict. There is no spiritual justification for genocide or the annihilation of a culture. If religion does not teach and practice the golden rule, then it has nothing to offer you. Before we can continue with the issues of sovereignty as it relates to the United States of America, we must address the issue of native sovereignty. Most Americans have heard the term sovereignty only as it refers to the native struggle for sovereign rights to self-determination and recognition of their indigenous cultures and nations. The Western nations and power structures cannot continue to ignore the indigenous peoples in our mostly destructive pursuit for property, wealth, and a now extinct manifest destiny. There are no continents or peoples left to conquer. The last frontier is internal and spiritual, as well as political and environmental, and we must include the indigenous people in this final quest for sovereignty for all the people. We the people have a spiritual debt to the indigenous people that can never be repaid. Until forgiveness and healing of these transgressions are complete, there will be no true happiness in these United States of America or any other European nation. The Western world is riddled with guilt and shame for the deeds done in the name of progress. 40 years before Christopher Columbus set foot in the Americas, Pope Nicholas V gave permission to King Alfonso of Portugal to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to take all their possessions and property and to put them into perpetual slavery. With this document and its predecessor in Roman law, Terra Nullius, Pope Nicholas declared war against all non-Christians throughout the world. The United States is commonly believed to conduct its affairs in accordance with separation of church and state. This is not true, however, with regard to the indigenous people of North America. This doctrine of discovery, an ancient doctrine of the Christian world, still serves as the foundation of federal Indian law in the United States. After Pope Alexander VI heard of Columbus's successful discovery, he promptly issued the Inter Cetera Bull on May 3, 1493, in which he declared that the Catholic faith and Christian religion be everywhere increased and spread, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. He called on the monarchs of Spain and Portugal to subdue and convert all native lands and possessions. In essence, he decreed that unconverted heathens had no rights. Even when indigenous people signed a treaty, it was considered non-binding because they were non-entities under the canon law. Thus, generations of treaties have been routinely dishonored, and indigenous people still sue for great injustice at the hands of their conquerors. The roots of religious persecution and racism go long and deep in the United States of America and around the world. The U.S. Supreme Court formally wrote the doctrine of discovery into the laws of the United States in the case of Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote, "Discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments. Indian people are still denied their rights simply because they were not Christians at the time of European arrival. Few people realize this legal distinction between Christians and the so-called heathens, i.e. indigenous peoples, Native Americans, the people, is still the law of the land today. Based on the doctrine of discovery and the resulting federal law, the United States continues to deny indigenous people the recognition of their sovereignty and treaty rights in in their own ancestral homelands of North America. Indigenous people still have unalienable, natural law rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations. This has never been refuted in American law, although the treaty law has not been respected. In my analysis, the indigenous people of North America never lost their sovereignty, but were conquered and subdued to the point of annihilation. Their lands were collateralized by the federal government. Many indigenous people, dispirited by the genocidal actions against them, temporarily surrendered to the federal system under the stewardship of the federal government. The indigenous people can reclaim their sovereignty by disengaging from the federal government and restoring political, economic, and legal sovereignty over their affairs as a nation, e.g., Onondaga tribe in New York. One of many steps needed to bring this immoral, although legal, system of colonization and exploitation to an end, the doctrine of discovery must be formally revoked by Pope John Paul II. An open letter has been written and submitted to Pope John Paul II for consideration, although he has ignored the request to date. Another step needed to restore sovereignty is to restore allodial land rights as a tribe in either a sovereign trust structure or by updating the tribal land patents. Restoring self-reliance, tribal traditions and language, and the land-based self-sufficiency of the indigenous people, along with economic self-reliance, is the major challenge to sovereignty. The federal United States government recognizes this sovereignty in very practical ways for their own self-interest. Consider this excerpt from an affidavit of a former high-level CLA operative who was responsible for developing a copy of the InSlaw software on the Cabazon Reservation. The Cabazon Band of Indians are a sovereign nation. The sovereign immunity that is accorded the Cabazons as a consequence of this fact made it feasible to pursue on the reservation the development and/or manufacture of materials whose development or manufacture would be subject to stringent controls off the reservation. That the indigenous people must get these casino gambling operations, mining, and other environmentally destructive industries off their reservations is essential to reclaiming tribal sovereignty. These casino gambling operations and other industries are a political and economic means to control and regulate the resources of the reservations through corporate enterprising. Thus, the reservations become subject to the New World Order, just like the rest of the common people of the world. If they are to be utilized wisely, then the funds generated by these industries must be used to rapidly rebuild the tribal infrastructure, dissolve these corporate operations promptly, and break all ties, except diplomatic, with the federal and state governments. Any native businesses or industries that remain can be integrated into a sovereign trust structure. This can be the legal instrument for implementing sovereignty in all tribal nations and having it recognized internationally by establishing self-government under the law of nations. There are over 3,000 indigenous nations, often nations within nations, that have not been recognized by the international community as sovereign nations with the unalienable rights of self-determination. Sovereignty movements are afoot in many of the stronger tribal cultures in North America and around the world. Indigenous treaty rights. Treaty law is supreme over all other laws pursuant to the Constitution. This includes treaties with indigenous people. Until we, the people, honor what we have promised to the indigenous people, the lies and deceit will continue unabated. We will be caught in our own lie turned inward. Honesty in all matters is imperative for sovereign people. Indigenous nations and people have the right to secure their homelands and provide for their people. Indigenous American people gave up vast territory and wealth under the white man's colonization. Indigenous American people, or Indians as they are called in the statutes, were not subject to any tax, The Buck Act, 1940, accepted Indians from the levy or collection of any tax, i.e., Indians not taxed. The federal United States could only tax its U.S. citizens. Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. Therefore, the federal government acts as if the treaties with indigenous people are not binding, nor are the treaties with indigenous people respected the same as treaties with European nations. As wards of the state without citizenship of any kind, indigenous American people were denied access to the state and federal courts. Therefore, indigenous people could not challenge the violations of their treaties, nor could they compel the federal government to any specific performance. Indigenous American people were neither sovereign state citizens like the white male property owners were, nor were they U.S. citizens of the federal United States. Emergency power statutes permits the abrogation of Indian treaties when any Indian tribe is in actual or contrived hostility. Could this be another convenient justification by the federal United States government for not honoring the treaties by executing a declared state of perpetual emergency on the reservations and Indian lands? These emergency powers must be lifted and lawful, de jure governments reestablished. A treaty is declared to be the supreme law of the land and is, therefore, obligatory on courts whenever it operates of itself without the aid of a legislative provision. U.S. versus Peggy. Today, neither the indigenous American people nor U.S. citizens have their treaties recognized by the federal United States. The Bill of Rights was a treaty between the sovereign state citizens and the federal United States government, which has no effect for U.S. citizens. The indigenous American people have been robbed of their land and treaty rights by the same sovereign power structure that is now robbing U.S. citizens of their land and treaty rights. Ironically, perhaps karma, the very land that was stolen from the indigenous American people because of the doctrine of discovery, is now being systematically stolen by the same old power structure, both at home and abroad. The indigenous American people, sovereign state citizens, and U.S. citizens are being colonized again. Indigenous U.S. citizens have civil rights, remedies, and recourse in the federal courts, and could compel performance of their treaties under admiralty, maritime, OR, military, martial law jurisdiction. The law of the sea, not the law of the land, operates in the federal courts. Argue the treaties from the basis of an international contract in force, or the lack thereof, not from the basis of the treaty or the common law. Many indigenous American people, those without a Native American tribal document, which certifies that they are still a sovereign people, have recently been naturalized as U.S. citizens. Although indigenous U.S. citizens are under federal jurisdiction, just like indigenous people on the reservation without civil rights, and have waived their sovereignty and unalienable rights, just like other U.S. citizens, indigenous American people could restore their full sovereign rights as state citizens with full state and federal constitutional and treaty rights available. By expatriating from their U.S. citizenship and naturalizing in a sovereign state, they could become sovereign state citizens and claim their treaty rights on behalf of all the other indigenous American people in their tribe through a class action lawsuit in the federal courts under admiralty jurisdiction and maritime procedures. The land patents on the land held in common on the reservation could be updated in the name of the tribal elders and be stewarded in a sovereign trust for the whole tribe. Ironically, this possible strategy for reclaiming sovereignty is comparable for both the colonized indigenous American people and the colonized American citizen. Thank you for tuning in to Hidden Sovereign Secrets Revealed. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.